Have you ever been so completely consumed by someone who, if you're being honest, was probably not very good for you? That you knew that they were inconsistent, that you couldn't rely on them, and that there were things about the relationship that just didn't make sense. And yet somehow that relationship felt more alive than anything that came before or after it. And then someone comes along who's kind, they're available, they're interested, they communicate, they show up. And then instead of thinking, this is amazing, you find yourself wondering, why don't I feel more? Maybe you even start missing the person who made you anxious. And then you remember the chemistry and the excitement and the anticipation and that feeling of being completely swept away by them. And then you start wondering, did you make a mistake even by leaving them? But what if the thing that you're remembering isn't actually evidence that they were the love of your life? What if you're remembering how intensely you felt while trying to get something because you weren't really sure that you could even have it? There is a real difference between feeling deeply connected to someone and feeling intensely activated by someone. And sometimes those two experiences can be very difficult to tell apart. That's what our video is about today. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Cyndi Darnell, sex and relationship therapist working with all kinds of people in all kinds of relationship configurations all over the world. And this channel is where we have the conversations that many of us are having in our heads, but not out loud. Here we talk about relationships, desire, intimacy, connection, friendships, emotions, grief, and what gets in the way. So if that's what you're here for, you're in the right place. Let's get into today's video. So we're going to start with something simple. I want you to think about a relationship where you never really knew where you stood. And maybe sometimes you felt incredibly close, and then suddenly something changed. They pulled away or they became harder to reach, and you didn't know what was happening. And then you started thinking about them more. You checked your phone and you're replaying conversations and you're wondering, what did I do? And then in that moment, of course, you're looking for reassurance. And then eventually they came back and they texted and they're like, yeah, I want to see you. And then suddenly they became affectionate again. And so for you, the relief is enormous. And for a moment, everything feels okay again. But that moment can actually be incredibly powerful, which is where something really important can happen. You may begin to associate the relief of that feeling with love and think, see, this is how much I care about this person. But notice the sequence. You didn't simply experience a connection. You experienced uncertainty, followed by distress, followed by reconnection, and that contrast can make the reconnection feel enormous. So let's try a practice here. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable and think about someone you've felt very intensely passionate about. You don't need to choose the most dramatic relationship of your life. Just bring one person to mind. And now ask yourself, when did I feel most connected to this person? Was it during the ordinary and peaceful moments together? Or was it after I had been afraid that I might lose them? And just notice what comes up. Keep your eyes closed, take a breath, and don't analyze it yet. Let this be just as it is. Slow down and bring that person to mind again, and notice what happens in your body as you think about them. Try not to change anything. Just notice. Does your chest tighten? Does your stomach change? Do you feel a pull towards them? Does your body become more energized? Or do you feel restless? Or maybe you feel warmth? Maybe you feel nothing, actually. There is no correct response here. Just notice what your body does when you bring this person to mind. And now imagine that person pulling away from you. And now notice what happens in your body. Keep your eyes closed. Take a breath. And now imagine them coming back and notice what changes again. Now, you don't have to decide what any of it means. We're not here for that. Not right now. But just experience that somatic difference in your nervous system. And now let that person go from your mind. Take a breath and feel where you are right now. Open your eyes and come back to the room. Sometimes we're not chasing that person. Sometimes we're chasing the change in how we feel. And this is one of the most important distinctions in understanding these relationships. Because when someone is consistently available, there isn't much uncertainty to solve. You know where you stand, and you don't have to work very hard to get their attention, right? You don't have to figure out whether they're coming back, and you don't have to convince yourself that you're still wanted. You know you are. And for someone who has become accustomed to uncertainty, which maybe is you, that can feel strangely flat. Not because there's no attraction or because the relationship is wrong, but because there isn't that same emotional roller coaster that you're used to. And your nervous system isn't constantly moving between, do I have them and am I losing you? And so without that movement, your experience can feel less intense, but that doesn't automatically make it less meaningful. It may simply make it different than what you're used to. And this is where attachment patterns really matter, because sometimes people can become especially sensitive to inconsistent connection. And if you've learned somewhere along the way that attention isn't guaranteed, you may become very focused on getting attention. You might find yourself giving more or trying harder or being more accommodating or reading the other person more carefully or trying to figure out what will bring them closer to you. And when it works, the payoff feels enormous, doesn't it? Not just because you're happy to see them, but because for that moment, the uncertainty has disappeared and you got the answer you were looking for. They still want me. I'm still important. I'm still chosen. And that can become a very powerful cycle, can't it? Because the harder the absence feels, the more significant the return feels. And the more significant the return feels, the harder it becomes to let go. But there's another side to unavailable relationships. Sometimes distance isn't only about wanting someone who doesn't fully choose you. Sometimes the distance itself creates a kind of buffer, a protection. Because if someone can never fully get close to you, then you never have to completely let yourself be known either. You get to be safe in that distance. There's longing, pursuit, fantasy, and anticipation. But there may not be that same level of sustained vulnerability that comes with someone actually being there. So an unavailable relationship can create a strange kind of paradox. You can feel intensely connected to someone while never having to experience real intimacy with them. You can feel enough to feel something, but they are also far enough away that you don't have to feel completely surrendered to being known. And that can happen in different attachment patterns for different reasons. The common thread is that the relationship doesn't require the same kind of sustained vulnerability that genuine intimacy does. So what about the relationship that you still can't get over? Maybe there is one person from years ago who still occupies room in your head rent-free. And maybe you've had other relationships, and maybe some of them were better than others and some were more, but were better matches for you. But that one person still has a kind of emotional charge for you. And so you might think, well, I'm never going to feel this again. But there's another possibility. Maybe what you're remembering isn't only that person, but maybe you're remembering who you were when you were with them. Especially because when we're young, we enter relationships with fewer defenses. And in that time in our lives, we don't know yet about how much love can hurt. And we haven't learned all the ways that we can protect ourselves. So we often, when we're younger, we give ourselves over to the experience in a way that becomes harder to repeat later in life. So it can be tempting to conclude that that person was different, that the relationship was different, that that was real love. But perhaps part of what was different was you, that you were more open and you were less guarded and you were more willing to feel everything. So that experience became a reference point. And then every relationship after that gets compared against an emotional experience that may have had as much to do with your own openness as it did with the person that you were with. So that doesn't mean that the relationship wasn't meaningful, but it might mean that the intensity is not the evidence that they were uniquely capable of making you feel that way. You played a part in it too. And then there's sex. And this becomes particularly obvious in relationships that are full of conflict. And you fight and you feel terrible, and then you think maybe, wow, the relationship's over. And then somehow you reconnect, and sometimes that reconnection becomes sexual. And then the sex, of course, becomes extraordinary, and you feel close and you feel wanted again, and all those doubts, they suddenly disappear. And that makes sense then, that you would interpret that experience as evidence of real love. But look at what happened immediately before it. There was fear, there was distance, and there was the possibility of losing the relationship, and then there's the reconnection. And so the contrast here really matters, because the relief of getting someone back makes that reconnection so much more powerful. And then sex can really intensify that experience even further. But if the conflict that caused the rupture hasn't actually been addressed, the relationship hasn't been repaired. This is important. You may have changed how you feel without changing what's happening between you. And once the intensity fades, that original problem is still going to be there. So sometimes you're left feeling even more desperate for that experience, because now you know how powerful that relief can feel. So the sex becomes a way of covering the wound rather than actually dealing with it. And real repair is different. Repair means the thing that caused the rupture is actually addressed. The relationship becomes more secure because something has changed, not simply because the two of you are just feeling closer again. So you may now be thinking, well, does healthy love mean giving up intensity? No, that is not the point. The point is that there are multiple ways for intensity to develop. And one kind comes from uncertainty. Do they want me? Are they leaving? Are they coming back? Can I get their attention? And that can create an enormous emotional experience. But there's another kind of intensity that develops because two people gradually become more known to one another. You trust them, you learn them, you become more vulnerable with each other, you discover each other, and you create experiences together. And that closeness doesn't have to be followed by abandonment and drama. You can learn that being fully yourself doesn't automatically make someone disappear. And that kind of intimacy may not arrive as an explosion, but it can be built. And this really matters because the goal is not to become numb. The goal is to stop needing chaos to feel alive. Now let's pause here again for a moment. Close your eyes and think about someone who feels emotionally safe to you. It could be a romantic partner, it could be a friend, it doesn't have to be a current relationship. And bring that person to mind. And take a breath and notice how your body feels. What happens when you imagine them being consistent with you? So not intensely pursuing you and not pulling away, not making you prove anything, just being there. Keep your eyes closed and notice your breath. Notice your shoulders. Notice your chest. Notice your stomach. And now ask yourself quietly, does calm feel good to me, or does some part of me experience calm as a lack of something? Don't answer that intellectually, just notice your body. And now imagine that same person becoming unavailable. Keep your eyes closed. They stop responding. You don't know whether you'll hear from them. And notice what happens inside your body. And now return to the image of them being steady and available. And notice the difference. There's nothing that you need to fix right now. You're just noticing your own responses. Take another breath. Slowly open your eyes and come back into the room. So you might be wondering, well, what if healthy feels boring? And this is where things can get confusing. Because if you've spent a lot of time experiencing relationships through uncertainty, consistency can feel very strange. You might be thinking, well, where's the excitement? Why don't I feel obsessed? Why am I not thinking about them constantly? Why aren't I nervous? And then you might interpret the absence of anxiety as the absence of attraction. But those aren't necessarily the same thing. Sometimes calm doesn't feel like peace when you're used to chaos, but it can actually feel like something is missing. And this has been a big one for me in my life for a good chunk of my teenage years, my 20s, and even a big chunk of my 30s. You know, like you watching this, I have really struggled with this because I've always been a very intense kind of person, a very passionate person. And so because I knew myself in that way, to think of myself as not having that in my relationships was a real question of my identity, that perhaps I didn't know myself, or that I thought in order to be fully me and authentically myself, that this was part of the deal. The good news is that I have worked through a lot of this and it's no longer a problem for me, but this is why I really understand this issue and want to share this video with you. So this doesn't mean that you have to force yourself to date people that you're not attracted to, but it means that the intensity of your nervous system is not a reliable measure of relationship quality. And so you have to learn to distinguish between, I don't want this person, and I'm not getting the emotional high that I am accustomed to. And these are two very different experiences. You don't have to get all of your connection from one person. And this is an important part of changing this pattern, is making sure that your romantic relationships are not carrying every emotional need you have. Connection can come from lots of different contexts, friends, and for polyamorous people, from other lovers, family, biological family, chosen family, community, and people who know you. When one person sort of suspiciously becomes one of your main sources of emotional connection or validation, their attention can start to feel enormously important. This is even true for polyamorous people. We can easily become very obsessed with one person. Every text matters, every delay matters, every change in affection matters. And that can make the relationship carry far more emotional weight than it can reasonably hold. So having other meaningful relationships, romantic or otherwise, gives us the opportunity to experience connection more broadly. And so rather than us approaching romance emotionally starved and hungry and expecting, one person to feed us everything, we can learn to tolerate the space between the stimulus and the response. So if we're accustomed to immediately seeking reassurance, this can be difficult. This is a hard thing for us to learn. So, when we feel anxious, we want them to respond. When we want to know where we stand, we want that feeling to stop. But if the only way we know how to regulate that feeling is to get something from another person, we have no power, and that cycle continues. So learning to settle ourselves doesn't mean that we stop needing people, but it means that another person's response isn't the only thing that's capable of making us feel okay. And that creates more freedom for us, because now we get to choose our relationships based on whether we actually want the person, not simply on whether or not that person relieves our anxiety. And so now here's the question that I'd like you to take with you from this video. The next time you feel an overwhelming attraction to someone, don't immediately ask, why do I want this person so badly? Instead, ask this: what happens inside me when I don't know whether I have them? And then ask, how do I feel when they are consistently available? And then ask, am I drawn to this person, or am I drawn towards finally getting something from this person that I have not been able to get? What happens inside me when I don't know whether I have them? These questions can tell you something very different about what you're experiencing, because sometimes what feels like chemistry is actually uncertainty. And sometimes what feels like longing is the desire for relief. And then sometimes what feels like proof that someone is uniquely special is actually a nervous system that has learnt to associate unpredictability with connection. And none of this means that your feelings aren't real. They are, they were, feelings are feelings. But the question is what those feelings were responding to. And you don't have to choose between passion and security. And this is the part that I really don't want you to miss. The alternative to a chaotic relationship isn't a lifeless relationship. And you don't have to trade desire for stability. You don't have to accept a relationship that feels empty or dull or boring simply because it's safe. The possibility is something else entirely. And what it is learning to build intensity without requiring instability to create it. So instead of needing someone to disappear before you can experience how much you want them, you can experience desire while they're still there. Or instead of needing conflict before you can feel close, you can build closeness through vulnerability. Or instead of needing rejection before you can appreciate connection, you can feel what it feels like to receive connection consistently. Or instead of waiting for the emotional crash that makes reunion extraordinary, you can create intimacy that deepens because neither of you had to disappear first. This kind of relationship may not give you the same rush on day one, but it gives you something else. It gives you the possibility of becoming more intimate over time, more known and more vulnerable and more connected and potentially more passionate. Because when you've actually created enough trust between you, you can actually let yourselves go deeper. And if you've spent years believing that the person who made you feel the most was the person who mattered the most, you might want to really question that assumption now based on this new information, because the goal is not to find a person that makes your nervous system go wild, but it is to recognize someone who allows you to feel deeply without requiring you to suffer. And because passion isn't owned by one person from your past, you can experience passion again. You can experience desire and you can experience intensity. You can experience the feeling of being completely open and connected. But it doesn't have to come from chasing someone who keeps running away from you. That has to stop. You can build it. You build it slowly with someone who stays. And perhaps the real shift is learning that love doesn't have to feel like losing someone and then getting them back. And sometimes love can feel like discovering each other over and over again, and that you can still be together. And that special thing, that becomes its own kind of intensity. So let me know in the comments, how did this land for you? This has been a lesson for me that's been so incredibly hard to learn. Like I said, such an important part of my development in my work professionally and also in my personal life, that this ebb and flow of chasing people who were fabulous but really unavailable, that it became so boring that I just could no longer find myself being attracted to people who didn't have the capacity, who didn't have the chops to meet me in the places that I wanted to be met. So yeah, I want you to really kind of sit with that and think about that if this is something, a pattern that's been really familiar to you. And if you would like to work with me, head on over to my website, cyndidarnell.com. I have online courses there for people who are interested in deepening their relationship skills, deepening their erotic skills. And also I offer counseling and coaching via Zoom all over the world. All of that information is on my website. And while you're there, you might also want to check out my book, Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. A lot of people who are in long-term relationships, especially people who struggle with this kind of stuff, can find in the initial stages that their libido can really go up and down and take a little bit of a hit as they're working through this, especially if you have a libido that tends to thrive on drama and intensity and chaos. You'll find my book really, really helpful. So please remember to like and subscribe. This is what the algorithm asks you to do. And certainly share this video. Share it far and wide. It teaches the algorithm that this work is important, that these stories are important, and that you think my work is worth following. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for sticking around to the end. And I'll see you next time. Bye for now.